September 1943. Edgewood Arsenal, Maryland. Private James Thornwell stepped off the bus at Edgewood Arsenal feeling a mixture of curiosity and relief. The 22-year-old from Georgia had been pulled from his infantry unit with dozens of other soldiers and told they were being reassigned to special duty that would help win the war. No more endless drilling, no more sleeping in muddy foxholes, no immediate prospect of being shipped to Europe or the Pacific to face German machine guns or Japanese banzai charges. The recruiter had made it sound almost cushy. Medical research duty at a facility in Maryland. Help doctors test new protective equipment and medicines that would save American lives. Maybe get some extra pay. Definitely avoid getting shot at. For a young black soldier who had grown up picking cotton in rural Georgia and who had no particular desire to die on a beach in France, it seemed like a lucky break. Thornwell had no way of knowing that he had just volunteered, though volunteered would prove to be a very flexible term for one of the most disturbing military medical experiments in American history. Over the next 33 years, approximately 60,000 American soldiers would pass through Edgewood Arsenal and similar facilities, where they would be locked in gas chambers, have chemical weapons sprayed on their skin, be injected with incapacitating agents, and in some cases be given drugs that would permanently damage their minds, and a disproportionate number of them, perhaps 60%, would be black soldiers like James Thornwell, deliberately selected based on their race. This is the story of how the United States Army conducted chemical weapons experiments on its own soldiers for over 3 decades, how it specifically targeted minority soldiers for the most dangerous tests, how it covered up the program for 50 years, and how it fought in court to prevent victims from receiving compensation even after the truth came out. It's a story that intersects with World War II, the Cold War, the Civil Rights Movement, and the ongoing debate about informed consent in medical research, and it's a story that remained classified, hidden from the soldiers who participated, from their families, from the American public, and even from the Veterans Administration doctors who decades later would deny disability benefits to men dying from exposure to chemical weapons their own government had tested on them. Edgewood Arsenal was established in 1917 during World War I as the United States ramped up its chemical weapons program, in response to the devastating use of poison gas on the Western Front. By World War I's end, chemical weapons had killed approximately 90,000 soldiers and injured over 1 million more. The horror of gas warfare, men choking to death on chlorine or phosgene, or suffering agonizing blistering from mustard gas, had made a profound impression on military planners. Chemical weapons were cheap to produce, difficult to defend against, and could render large areas of battlefield impassable. They were, military theorists concluded, likely to play a major role in any future war. The United States, like other major powers, signed the Geneva Protocol of 1925, which prohibited the first use of chemical weapons in warfare. But the protocol did not prohibit developing, producing, or stockpiling chemical weapons, only using them first. And importantly, it did not prohibit researching defensive measures against chemical weapons. This loophole would provide the legal justification for decades of experimentation on human subjects at Edgewood Arsenal and other facilities. Through the 1920s and 1930s, Edgewood Arsenal continued operating at a low level, conducting research into chemical agents and defensive equipment, but the approach of World War II dramatically increased the urgency and scale of this work. Intelligence reports suggested that Nazi Germany had continued developing chemical weapons despite the Geneva Protocol. The Japanese military had used chemical weapons extensively in China. There was legitimate concern that chemical warfare might be employed in the coming conflict, and that American troops needed to be prepared to fight in a contaminated environment. This created a problem. How do you develop protective equipment and medical countermeasures for chemical weapons without actually exposing people to those weapons? You can test gas masks and protective suits on mannequins or animals to some extent, but ultimately, you need to know how human beings react to exposure. You need to know what dosages cause what symptoms, how quickly symptoms appear, how long they last, what treatments work. And the only way to get that information is to expose actual human beings to actual chemical weapons under controlled conditions. The Army's solution was human testing using soldier volunteers. Starting in 1942, as the United States entered World War II, Edgewood Arsenal began recruiting soldiers for what were officially called volunteer test programs. The recruitment pitch emphasized patriotism and medical advancement. Soldiers were told they would be helping to develop defenses that would save American lives, both in the current war and in future conflicts. They were offered modest financial incentives, extra pay ranging from a few dollars for minor tests to several $100s for more extensive participation. They were promised that the tests would be carefully controlled and medically supervised. What the recruitment pitch did not emphasize, and what soldiers were often not told at all, was exactly what chemicals they would be exposed to, what the potential long-term health effects might be, or that the program specifically sought to recruit Black and Puerto Rican soldiers in numbers far exceeding their representation in the Army as a whole. The racial composition of the test program was not accidental. Military medical researchers in the 1940s were operating under assumptions that seem shocking today, but were widely accepted in an era of legal segregation and Jim Crow. There was a belief among some researchers that different races might respond differently to chemical weapons, that black skin might be more or less susceptible to mustard gas burns than white skin, or that racial differences in lung capacity or blood chemistry might affect responses to inhaled agents. These beliefs were not based on any scientific evidence, they were simply racist assumptions dressed up in scientific language. But beyond these pseudo-scientific rationales, there was a more pragmatic and even more disturbing reason for targeting minority soldiers: they were considered more expendable. Black soldiers and Puerto Rican soldiers were less likely to have connections to powerful politicians or wealthy lawyers. They were less likely to complain effectively if something went wrong. They came from communities that had less political power and less ability to demand accountability. And in the blunt calculus of military medical research, this made them attractive subjects for experiments that might cause permanent harm. The program's architect was Major General William Porter, who commanded Edgewood Arsenal's medical research laboratories. Porter was a respected figure in military medicine, a physician who had served in World War I, and who genuinely believed that his work was necessary to protect American soldiers from chemical attack. But Porter operated in an era with very different ethical standards regarding human experimentation. The Nuremberg Code, which would establish principles of informed consent in medical research, would not be written until 1947, in response to Nazi medical experiments revealed during the Nuremberg trials. When Porter's program began in 1942, there were no clear regulations governing human experimentation, no institutional review boards, no requirement that subjects understand the risks they were accepting. The early tests focused primarily on mustard gas, which had been the most widely used chemical weapon in World War I, and which all major powers were assumed to have stockpiled for potential use in World War II. Mustard gas, formerly known as sulfur mustard, is a vesicant, meaning it causes severe blistering of any tissue it contacts. It damages skin, eyes, and respiratory tract. Exposure to mustard gas is agonizing. It causes blindness that can be temporary or permanent. It creates chemical burns that can take months to heal and leave permanent scars, and it's a carcinogen. Exposure increases the risk of cancer decades later. The Edgewood mustard gas tests took several forms. In the mildest version, small amounts of liquid mustard agent were applied to patches of skin, usually on soldiers' forearms, and covered with bandages for specified periods to measure how quickly blistering occurred and how severe the damage was at different dosages. These patch tests were painful and left permanent scarring, but they were the least dangerous version of the experiments. More severe were the chamber tests. Soldiers were placed in sealed rooms where mustard gas vapor was released. Some soldiers wore protective equipment being tested: gas masks, protective suits, barrier creams, while others, serving as controls, wore no protection or only partial protection. The soldiers would remain in the chamber for periods ranging from 10 minutes to 2 hours while medical personnel observed them through windows, recording when symptoms appeared and how severe they became. The chamber tests were terrifying experiences. Soldiers described the initial exposure as creating a sensation of warmth on exposed skin that quickly progressed to burning pain. Eyes would begin to water and then burn intensely. Breathing became difficult as the gas irritated nasal passages and lungs. Within hours after exposure, skin would begin to blister. The blisters could cover large areas of the body and were intensely painful. They could become infected. Severe exposures caused blistering of the respiratory tract, chemical burns inside the lungs, leading to pneumonia-like symptoms that could last for weeks. Private James Thornwell's first exposure to mustard gas came in a chamber test in late 1943. He was one of 12 soldiers locked in a sealed room, measuring approximately 12 feet by 15 feet. 6 soldiers wore gas masks being evaluated for procurement, 6 wore no protection, and served as the control group measuring unprotected exposure effects. Thornwell was in the unprotected group. Decades later, in testimony before a congressional committee, Thornwell described what happened. "They told us to sit on benches along the wall. They said they were going to release some vapor, and we should just breathe normally and tell them when we started feeling anything. Then they left and sealed the door. After a couple of minutes you could see this yellowish fog coming from vents near the floor. It smelled sort of sweet at first, kind of like mustard or horseradish, then it started to burn. My eyes started watering and I couldn't stop coughing. The burning got worse and worse. I could see the guys with the masks were okay, but those of us without were in bad shape. One guy started screaming and pounding on the door. We were in there for what felt like forever, but was probably only 15 minutes. When they finally let us out, we couldn't see straight. Our skin felt like it was on fire." Thornwell spent the next 3 weeks in the base hospital. The exposed areas of his skin developed massive blisters. His eyes were so damaged he was temporarily blind. His lungs were burned, causing breathing difficulties that would persist for the rest of his life. He was told that his participation had provided valuable data for protecting American troops, and that he should be proud of his service. He was paid $50 for his participation. He was required to sign a document swearing never to discuss what had happened, under threat of court-martial for revealing classified information. Thornwell was one of approximately 7,000 soldiers exposed to mustard gas at Edgewood Arsenal and other facilities during World War II. His experience was not unusual. Many soldiers suffered similar injuries. Some suffered worse. At least a dozen soldiers died from acute exposure to chemical agents during the tests, though the exact number remains unknown because records were classified and some were deliberately destroyed. But mustard gas, despite its horrifying effects, was not the most dangerous chemical tested on soldiers at Edgewood Arsenal. As the war progressed and especially after it ended, the program expanded to include nerve agents, chemical weapons far more lethal than anything used in World War I. Nerve agents were first developed by Nazi Germany in the 1930s. German chemists researching new insecticides had accidentally discovered a class of organophosphate compounds that were extraordinarily toxic to humans. These compounds, initially called tabun, sarin and soman, worked by inhibiting the enzyme acetylcholinesterase, which is essential for nerve function. Exposure to even small amounts causes a cascade of symptoms: excessive salivation, tearing and sweating, muscle twitching and spasms, difficulty breathing, seizures, and at higher doses death within minutes from respiratory failure or cardiac arrest. The Nazis manufactured nerve agents in substantial quantities during World War II but never used them in combat, apparently because Hitler, who had been gassed during World War I, was reluctant to initiate chemical warfare. And because German military leaders feared retaliation with chemical weapons they knew the Allies possessed. After Germany's defeat, Allied forces discovered stockpiles of nerve agents and the factories that produced them. The US and Soviet Union both captured German chemical weapons scientists and documentation, and both began producing their own nerve agents. Part 2, Continuation. By the early 1950s, Edgewood Arsenal had begun testing nerve agents on American soldiers. The Army had produced its own versions of the German nerve agents and had developed new variants, including VX, an agent so toxic that a single drop on the skin could be lethal. The stated justification remained defensive research, developing protective equipment, decontamination procedures, and medical countermeasures. But the testing was extraordinarily dangerous, far more so than even the mustard gas experiments that had injured thousands of soldiers during World War II. The nerve agent tests followed protocols similar to the mustard gas experiments, but with theoretically tighter controls given the extreme lethality of the substances involved. Soldiers would be exposed to carefully measured doses, either through skin contact with liquid agent or through inhalation of vapor in sealed chambers, while medical personnel monitored their vital signs and symptoms. Atropine and other antidotes were kept ready to administer if symptoms became too severe. The goal was to expose soldiers to doses high enough to produce observable symptoms but low enough to avoid death or permanent injury. In practice, this balance proved difficult to maintain. Nerve agents are extraordinarily unpredictable in their effects. the same dose that produces only mild symptoms in one person might cause convulsions and respiratory failure in another. Individual variations in body weight, metabolism, enzyme levels and other factors mean that safe doses don't exist in any absolute sense. Some soldiers exposed to what were supposed to be subclinical doses developed severe symptoms requiring emergency intervention. Others were left with long-term neurological damage, tremors, memory problems, difficulty concentrating, that persisted long after the acute effects had resolved. Sergeant Robert Byers participated in VX nerve agent testing in 1968, near the end of the Edgewood program. He was a white soldier from Pennsylvania, one of the minority of non-black test subjects, recruited with promises of extra pay and easy duty. In a 2012 interview with NPR, Byers described his experience. "They put a single drop of something on my forearm, just one drop, about the size of a pinhead. Within a few minutes I started feeling strange. My muscles were twitching. I was sweating profusely even though it wasn't hot. My vision got blurry. Then I started having trouble breathing. They gave me an injection atropine, I found out later, and that helped, but I felt terrible for days. Headaches, nausea, couldn't concentrate. And that was from one drop. They told me that if they'd used 2 drops, I might have died. I couldn't believe they were doing this to American soldiers." Byers' experience, while frightening, was relatively controlled compared to some of the earlier nerve agent tests conducted in the 1950s, when protocols were less developed and antidotes less refined. During this period, several soldiers came terrifyingly close to death from exposure. At least 3 soldiers are believed to have died from nerve agent exposure during testing, their deaths officially attributed to other causes in records that remained classified for decades. But beyond the immediate physical dangers of chemical exposure, another category of experiments at Edgewood Arsenal would prove even more disturbing: the mind-altering drug tests that began in the 1950s and continued into the 1970s. These experiments were part of a broader CIA and Army program investigating potential uses of drugs and chemicals for interrogation, psychological warfare, and mind control. The most infamous aspect of this research was Project MKUltra, the CIA's program that dosed unwitting civilians and soldiers with LSD and other drugs in an effort to develop interrogation techniques and explore whether drugs could be used to control behavior. Edgewood Arsenal became one of the primary sites for military testing of incapacitating agents, chemicals designed not to kill but to temporarily disable enemy forces. The Army was interested in developing weapons that could render enemy soldiers unable to fight without killing them, theoretically allowing capture of enemy forces intact or rendering them unable to defend territory that could then be occupied. This research focused on drugs and chemicals that affected the mind rather than the body, causing confusion, hallucinations, or inability to perform coordinated action. The primary chemical tested was BZ-3-quinaclynyl benzylate, a hallucinogenic compound similar to LSD but with longer-lasting effects. BZ causes delirium, hallucinations, high body temperature, and a disconnection from reality that can last for days. It's a terrifying experience. Subjects often have no memory of their actions during the period of intoxication, and the hallucinations can be nightmarish. The military saw potential for using BZ as a weapon that could incapacitate enemy forces without the deaths and destruction caused by conventional weapons, though whether drugging enemy soldiers into hallucinogenic states actually constituted a more humane form of warfare was a question that apparently did not receive serious consideration. Testing BZ on human subjects was ethically problematic in ways that went beyond even the mustard gas and nerve agent experiments. With chemical weapons, there was at least a clear defensive rationale. American troops might face these weapons and needed protection. But BZ was purely an offensive weapon. Testing it on American soldiers served no defensive purpose. The soldiers exposed to BZ were essentially guinea pigs in a program exploring weapons that might be used to drug enemy populations. Specialist William Blazek volunteered for drug testing at Edgewood Arsenal in 1968. He was told only that he would be testing medical compounds and that the tests would involve no lasting harm. What Blazek was not told was that he would be given BZ and monitored as he descended into a days-long hallucinogenic nightmare. In testimony decades later, Blazek described fragmented memories of the experience, seeing faces melting, believing he was being attacked by invisible enemies, having no sense of who or where he was. He was restrained to a bed for portions of the experience when medical staff worried he might hurt himself. For days after the drug's acute effects wore off, he suffered confusion, memory problems, and vivid flashbacks. The psychological impact never fully resolved. Decades later, Blazek still suffered from anxiety and disturbing intrusive memories related to his experience. The BZ program tested approximately 2,800 soldiers between 1959 and 1975. Many experienced psychological trauma that lasted far longer than the drug's immediate effects. Some soldiers suffered what appeared to be permanent psychological damage, chronic anxiety, depression, difficulty forming memories, flashbacks to the hallucinogenic experience. The long-term mental health impact of being drugged into a terrifying altered state, often with no memory of what you did during the experience, proved in many cases more damaging than the physical injuries from chemical weapons exposure. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Edgewood Arsenal experiments, the detail that transformed them from a troubling Cold War-era research program into a scandal that would eventually provoke congressional investigations and demands for accountability, was the systematic racial bias in how subjects were selected and what tests they were subjected to. Statistical analysis of the Edgewood Arsenal program, conducted decades later when records were finally declassified, revealed stark racial disparities. While African Americans comprised approximately 12% of U.S. Army personnel during the peak years of the testing program, they represented an estimated 60% of the soldiers subjected to chemical weapons testing at Edgewood Arsenal. Puerto Rican soldiers, who represented perhaps 2–3% of Army personnel, made up an estimated 20% of test subjects. White soldiers were dramatically underrepresented relative to their numbers in the service. The racial disparity was even more pronounced when looking at the types of tests different groups were subjected to. Black and Puerto Rican soldiers were disproportionately assigned to the most dangerous experiments, high-dose exposures to mustard gas and nerve agents, tests of experimental drugs with unknown effects, trials of protective equipment that was untested or known to be inadequate. White soldiers, when they participated at all, were more likely to be assigned to lower-risk tests, low-dose exposures, tests of equipment known to be effective, or control groups that received placebo substances rather than active agents. This racial selection was not accidental. Declassified documents reveal that it was deliberate policy, justified through a combination of racist pseudoscience and cold pragmatism. Some researchers genuinely believed they were conducting scientific research into racial differences in response to chemical weapons, but many documents reveal a more straightforward calculation. Minority soldiers were selected because they were perceived as less likely to complain, less able to demand accountability, and less politically costly if something went wrong. A 1944 memorandum from an Edgewood Arsenal medical officer, declassified in 1993, stated bluntly, "Colored troops are well suited for gas chamber trials, as they are less likely to have influential relatives who might make inquiries about medical complications." Another document from 1946 recommended recruiting Puerto Rican soldiers because the language barrier reduces the likelihood of subjects fully understanding potential risks or effectively communicating complaints. A 1950s-era document discussing the expansion of the nerve agent testing program noted that Negro troops provide a ready supply of test subjects with minimal administrative complications. These documents, shocking in their casual racism, reveal that the racial targeting of test subjects was not an incidental byproduct of the program, but an intentional strategy. Researchers specifically sought out Black and Puerto Rican soldiers because they believed these men could be experimented on with less risk of facing consequences. The experiences of soldiers from the 65th Infantry Regiment, a segregated unit composed almost entirely of Puerto Rican soldiers, illustrate the systematic nature of this targeting. In 1952, substantial portions of the 65th Infantry were transferred to Edgewood Arsenal on what was described as special training rotation. The soldiers were told they would be receiving advanced training in chemical warfare defense. In practice, entire companies of Puerto Rican soldiers were subjected to intensive chemical weapons testing chamber exposures to mustard gas and nerve agents, tests of protective equipment, drug trials. The soldiers were told they could not discuss the tests with anyone outside the program due to their classified nature, and most could not easily communicate with family back in Puerto Rico even if they had wanted to report what was happening to them. Sergeant Manuel Rodriguez was part of the 65th Infantry Contingent sent to Edgewood Arsenal. In testimony to congressional investigators in 2015, Rodriguez, then in his late 80s and suffering from respiratory disease, skin conditions, and early-stage dementia that he attributed to his chemical exposure, described systematic testing that continued for months. Every week, sometimes twice a week, they would take us to the chambers. Sometimes it was gas, sometimes they gave us shots or pills. We were told this was necessary training, that we needed to know what these weapons felt like so we could fight if the enemy used them. But they kept testing us over and over. Many of us got sick, some were sent to the hospital. One man from my company died. They said it was pneumonia, but we knew it was from the gas. We couldn't tell anyone what was happening because we'd signed papers saying we would be court-martialed if we talked, and most of us didn't speak English well enough to complain effectively anyway. The use of language barriers to prevent complaints was a recurring theme. Puerto Rican soldiers often received instructions and consent forms in English that they could not fully understand. When they tried to report side effects or injuries, language difficulties made effective communication with medical staff difficult. Some soldiers reported that when they tried to explain symptoms to doctors, they were dismissed as malingerers or hypochondriacs, a particularly cruel response given that the soldiers had been deliberately exposed to toxins as part of a military program. The deliberate targeting of minority soldiers for dangerous experiments was not unique to Edgewood Arsenal, it was part of a broader pattern in American military and medical research during this era. The infamous Tuskegee syphilis study, which ran from 1932 to 1972, deliberately left black men untreated for syphilis to study the disease's natural progression. Radiation experiments conducted in the 1940s and 1950s targeted vulnerable populations including prisoners, the mentally disabled, and cancer patients who were often not told they were being used in experiments. Edgewood Arsenal fit into this larger pattern of using vulnerable politically powerless populations as test subjects for research that more privileged groups would never have been subjected to. The long-term health consequences of the Edgewood Arsenal experiments emerged slowly over the decades following exposure. Many soldiers who participated in the tests experienced immediate injuries, chemical burns, respiratory damage, psychological trauma, but the full scope of the damage only became apparent years or decades later, as soldiers who had been exposed to mustard gas, nerve agents, and experimental drugs began developing cancers, respiratory diseases, neurological conditions, and mental health problems at rates far exceeding those of soldiers who had not been in the test programs. Mustard gas is a known carcinogen. Soldiers exposed to it at Edgewood Arsenal developed elevated rates of lung cancer, skin cancer, and leukemia. Many of these cancers didn't appear until the soldiers were in their 50s, 60s, or 70s, decades after their exposure, making it difficult to prove causation even when the connection seemed obvious. Respiratory damage from mustard gas exposure caused chronic bronchitis, emphysema, and other lung diseases that progressively worsened over time. Nerve agent exposure appeared to cause long-term neurological effects including tremors, difficulty with fine motor control, memory problems, and symptoms similar to Parkinson's disease. Soldiers who had been exposed to BZ and other mind-altering drugs suffered elevated rates of mental illness including depression, anxiety disorders, and post-traumatic stress disorder. Some former test subjects struggled with substance abuse, apparently attempting to self-medicate the psychological distress caused by their experiences at Edgewood Arsenal. But when these veterans sought treatment from the Veterans Administration for conditions they believed were connected to their participation in the chemical weapons testing program, they encountered a bureaucratic wall. The Edgewood Arsenal program was classified. Most soldiers who participated had signed non-disclosure agreements swearing them to secrecy. The VA medical system had no records indicating that these veterans had been exposed to chemical weapons because the Pentagon had not shared that information. When veterans claimed that their cancers or respiratory diseases or neurological problems were service-connected injuries stemming from chemical weapons exposure at Edgewood Arsenal, VA doctors had no documentation to support these claims, and often assumed the veterans were either mistaken or lying in an attempt to receive undeserved disability benefits. This created a cruel catch-22. Veterans who were suffering from conditions caused by secret military experiments could not prove they had been in those experiments because the experiments were classified, and they had been sworn to secrecy about their participation under threat of court-martial. Soldiers who had patriotically volunteered for what they were told was important defensive research, who had been injured in that research, were denied medical care and disability compensation because the government refused to acknowledge what it had done to them. The wall of secrecy around the Edgewood Arsenal program began to crack in the 1970s. The Church Committee, a Senate committee investigating intelligence agency abuses, exposed Project MKUltra and other CIA programs involving human experimentation with drugs. This investigation revealed that military facilities including Edgewood Arsenal had participated in related research. The Army was forced to acknowledge that chemical and drug testing on soldiers had occurred, though it minimized the scope and severity of the experiments. In 1975, the Army officially ended the human testing program at Edgewood Arsenal, but it continued to resist comprehensive disclosure of what had been done. Records remained classified, lists of participants were not released. Veterans who came forward claiming to have been test subjects were often told that the Army had no record of their participation, even when the veterans could provide specific details about the experiments they had been subjected to. The breakthrough came in the 1990s when portions of the Edgewood Arsenal records were declassified under pressure from veterans' advocates and congressional investigators. These records confirmed what veterans had been claiming for decades, that approximately 60,000 soldiers had been exposed to chemical weapons and experimental drugs between 1942 and 1975, that the exposures had caused both immediate injuries and long-term health problems, that proper informed consent had often not been obtained, and that minority soldiers had been systematically targeted for the most dangerous experiments. The declassification of records allowed a 1993 National Academy of Sciences investigation that examined the long-term health impacts of Edgewood Arsenal participants. The investigation concluded that soldiers exposed to mustard gas had elevated rates of multiple cancers, that nerve agent exposure appeared linked to neurological problems, and that the drug experiments had caused lasting psychological harm to many participants. The report called for the military to identify all surviving test subjects, inform them of what they had been exposed to, and provide appropriate medical monitoring and treatment, but identifying test subjects proved difficult. The military's records were incomplete. Some records had been deliberately destroyed, others had been lost or misfiled, and many records identified test subjects only by service number without sufficient additional information to locate them decades later. The Pentagon estimated that it could positively identify only about 40% of the soldiers who had participated in the program. This meant that thousands of veterans who had been exposed to chemical weapons and drugs at Edgewood Arsenal could not prove their participation, and therefore could not receive compensation or specialized medical care for conditions related to that exposure. Even veterans who could prove they had been test subjects faced obstacles in receiving disability compensation. The VA required that veterans establish a direct causal connection between their participation in the tests and their current medical conditions. For cancers that typically appear decades after exposure, proving causation was nearly impossible. How could you demonstrate that lung cancer diagnosed in 1990 was caused by mustard gas exposure in 1944, rather than by the veteran's smoking history or some other factor? The VA developed a presumptive service connection policy for certain conditions, meaning that veterans who could prove they were test subjects and who developed specific cancers or respiratory diseases would automatically qualify for disability benefits without having to prove individual causation. But the list of presumptive conditions was narrow, and many veterans suffering from health problems they attributed to their test participation remained uncompensated. The legal battles fought by Edgewood Arsenal veterans revealed another cruel obstacle, a Supreme Court doctrine that effectively barred them from suing the military for injuries suffered during service. The Farrier's Doctrine, established in a 1950 Supreme Court case, held that military personnel could not sue the federal government under the Federal Tort Claims Act for injuries that arose out of or were incident to their military service. This doctrine was intended to prevent the courts from second-guessing military decisions and to maintain discipline within the armed forces. But the Farrier's Doctrine had an unintended consequence. It meant that soldiers who were injured through negligence, recklessness, or even deliberate harm by the military had no legal recourse. Unlike civilian research subjects who were harmed in medical experiments and could sue for damages, military personnel harmed in experiments had no ability to seek compensation through the courts. The case of James Stanley illustrated the stark injustice of this doctrine. Stanley was a master sergeant who had been given LSD without his knowledge in 1958, as part of the Edgewood Arsenal drug testing program. He had been told he was testing protective equipment, but had actually been given powerful hallucinogens and monitored for their effects. Stanley suffered severe psychological problems following the experiment. He experienced violent outbursts, hallucinations, and periods of disorientation. His marriage fell apart. He struggled to maintain employment. Only years later, when portions of the LSD testing program were declassified, did Stanley learn what had been done to him. Stanley sued the government in 1983, seeking compensation for the harm caused by being drugged without his knowledge or consent. His case made it all the way to the Supreme Court, which in 1987 ruled against him 5-4. The majority opinion held that even though Stanley had been subjected to an experiment that would have been illegal if conducted on civilians, and even though he had not given informed consent, the fair use doctrine barred his lawsuit because the injury had occurred during his military service. Justice Antonin Scalia, writing for the majority, acknowledged that the decision seemed harsh but argued that allowing soldiers to sue would undermine military discipline and that any remedy for military misconduct should come from Congress, not the courts. Justice Sandra Day O'Connor wrote a scathing dissent. The medical trials at Nuremberg in 1947 deeply impressed upon the world that experimentation with unknowing human subjects is morally and legally unacceptable. The United States Military Tribunal established the Nuremberg Code as a standard against which to judge German scientists who experimented with human subjects. In defiance of this principle, military intelligence officials began surreptitiously testing chemical and biological materials, including LSD, on unwitting human subjects. The government has argued that there is a military necessity for testing troops with hallucinogens to prepare them for potential exposure in combat. That argument, however, does not convince me. No judicially crafted rule should insulate from liability the involuntary and unknowing human experimentation alleged to have occurred in this case. Despite O'Connor's powerful dissent, the fair use doctrine remained intact. Veterans who had been used as guinea pigs in chemical weapons experiments, who had suffered lasting injuries, and who had been systematically lied to about the risks they were accepting had no ability to sue for compensation. Their only recourse was to appeal to Congress for legislation providing benefits, or to work through the VA disability system that was often hostile to their claims. In the decades since the program's exposure, Congress has incrementally expanded benefits for Edgewood Arsenal veterans, but the compensation has remained limited. In 1991, Congress passed legislation requiring the Pentagon to identify and notify all test subjects. In 2003, Congress expanded the list of presumptive conditions qualifying for automatic disability benefits. Various bills have provided modest lump sum payments to test subjects, typically a few $1,000s, a pittance compared to the lifetime medical costs and suffering many veterans endured. The racial dimension of the Edgewood Arsenal program has received less attention and less remedy than perhaps any other aspect. While Congress has provided some recognition and compensation to test subjects generally, there has been no specific acknowledgement of the fact that Black and Puerto Rican soldiers were systematically targeted for the most dangerous experiments, nor any additional compensation for these veterans beyond what white test subjects received. The deliberate racial exploitation that characterized the program has been largely written out of the official narrative in favor of a more comfortable story about misguided Cold War-era research that affected all participants equally, a narrative that the declassified documents clearly contradict. For surviving veterans like James Thornwell, now in their 90s or already deceased, the lack of full accountability remained a source of anger and pain. Thornwell, who eventually received a modest disability payment for his respiratory problems and skin conditions related to mustard gas exposure, testified before Congress in 2015 at age 94. "They used us because we were Black, and they thought nobody would care. They thought we didn't matter. Well, we did matter. We were American soldiers. We deserved better. My friends who died from what they did to us, they deserved better. And the government never really said they were sorry. They gave us a little money and acted like that made it all okay. But it's not okay. What they did was wrong, and they should say so." The Edgewood Arsenal program officially ended in 1975, but its legacy continues to shape military medical research ethics. The revelations about Edgewood, combined with exposure of other human experimentation scandals like the Tuskegee syphilis study and radiation experiments, led to fundamental reforms in how research on human subjects is conducted and regulated. The National Research Act of 1974 established institutional review boards to oversee human subjects research. Informed consent requirements were strengthened and clarified. Special protections were created for vulnerable populations. Military research on service members was subjected to stricter oversight. These reforms have made it much harder to conduct the kind of unethical experiments that characterized Edgewood Arsenal. Modern military medical research requires genuine informed consent, independent ethical review, and careful documentation of risks and benefits. Soldiers cannot be coerced into participating in research, and they have the right to withdraw at any time without penalty. But questions remain about whether the lessons of Edgewood Arsenal have been fully learned. The military still conducts medical research that requires human subjects, testing protective equipment, developing medical countermeasures against chemical and biological weapons, evaluating treatments for combat injuries. This research is necessary and important, but it requires trust that the military will not abuse its power over service members, that it will obtain genuine consent, that it will not exploit vulnerable populations, and that it will provide appropriate care for research participants who are harmed. The Edgewood Arsenal veterans' struggle for recognition and compensation also raises broader questions about accountability for government wrongdoing. When the government deliberately harms its own citizens, even if it does so in the name of national security or scientific research, what remedies should be available? If courts bar lawsuits and Congress provides only limited compensation, has justice been done? And what message does inadequate accountability send about the value our society places on the lives of marginalized groups? The surviving records of the Edgewood Arsenal program include photographs of the experiments, images that are shocking in their clinical documentation of human suffering. Photographs show soldiers' arms covered in mustard gas burns. Other photographs show soldiers restrained in beds during drug experiments, their faces contorted in apparent distress or confusion. There are images of gas chambers where soldiers were exposed to toxic vapors while medical personnel observed through viewing windows. These photographs provide visual evidence of what was done, but they also raise uncomfortable questions about the researchers and photographers who documented this suffering without apparent ethical qualms. How did doctors and scientists who had taken oaths to first do no harm rationalize subjecting soldiers to chemical weapons and mind-altering drugs? How did military officers justify selecting soldiers for dangerous experiments based on their race? How did this program continue for over 3 decades without anyone in a position of authority stopping it and saying this is wrong? The answer seems to be that institutional culture, bureaucratic momentum, and rationalization allowed individually decent people to participate in a collectively immoral program. Researchers convinced themselves they were doing necessary work to protect American troops from enemy chemical weapons. They told themselves the risks were acceptable and carefully controlled. They believed that soldiers' voluntary participation, even if that participation was obtained through incomplete information and financial pressure, constituted adequate consent. And they absorbed the racist assumptions of their era that suggested minority lives were worth less than white lives, that using black and Puerto Rican soldiers as test subjects was somehow more acceptable than using white soldiers. These rationalizations were self-serving and wrong, but they were apparently sufficient to allow the program to continue until external pressure finally forced it to end. The lesson is sobering. Institutional evil does not require cartoon villains consciously choosing to do harm. It can arise from ordinary people accepting inadequate ethical standards, failing to question unjust policies, and prioritizing institutional goals over individual welfare. The Edgewood Arsenal story is ultimately about power and vulnerability. The military had enormous power over soldiers, the power to order them into danger, to punish them for disobedience, to classify information they might reveal. Soldiers, especially minority soldiers from marginalized communities, were vulnerable, economically dependent on military pay, subject to military discipline, lacking the resources or connections to resist exploitation. When power met vulnerability without adequate ethical constraints or accountability mechanisms, the result was systematic abuse that harmed thousands of men and was covered up for decades. Today, approximately 60,000 American soldiers were exposed to chemical weapons and experimental drugs at Edgewood Arsenal and similar facilities between 1942 and 1975. Roughly 40,000 of those soldiers have been identified. Many have died, from old age, from conditions related to their exposure, from unrelated causes. Several thousand survive now in their 80s and 90s, many dealing with health problems they attribute to their participation in the experiments. They live with the physical and psychological scars of what was done to them, with inadequate compensation, and with the knowledge that their government used them as guinea pigs, and then tried to hide what it had done. The gas chambers at Edgewood Arsenal were dismantled decades ago. The facility still exists as part of Aberdeen Proving Ground, still conducting military research, though under very different ethical guidelines. There is no memorial at the site commemorating the soldiers who were experimented on there, no plaque acknowledging what happened, nothing to mark that this was the location where American soldiers were locked in chambers and gassed, where they were given drugs that broke their minds, where they were used as test subjects in experiments that violated fundamental principles of human dignity and medical ethics. Perhaps there should be. Perhaps there should be a memorial listing the names of the 60,000 soldiers who were test subjects, with special recognition for the minority soldiers who were deliberately targeted for the most dangerous experiments. Perhaps there should be an acknowledgement that this happened, that it was wrong, and that we are committed to ensuring it never happens again. Perhaps the families of soldiers who died from exposure to the chemicals tested at Edgewood Arsenal deserve to know what really killed their loved ones. Perhaps the survivors deserve a full apology, not just modest disability payments and grudging acknowledgement, but memorials and apologies cannot undo what was done. They cannot give back the years of life lost to cancer or respiratory disease. They cannot restore the marriages destroyed by psychological trauma. They cannot heal the wounded minds of men who were given hallucinogens without their knowledge and monitored as they descended into nightmares. They cannot compensate for the decades of denied medical care and disability benefits. They cannot make whole the lives that were damaged when soldiers who volunteered to serve their country were instead used as experimental subjects in a program that prioritized research data over human welfare. The story of the Edgewood Arsenal experiments is one that Americans should know and should never forget. It is a story about the dangers of government secrecy, about the ease with which ethical standards can be abandoned in the name of national security, about the vulnerability of those who lack power and voice, and about the long struggle for accountability when the government harms its own citizens. It is a story that should make us ask hard questions about power, ethics, and justice. And it is a story that should remind us that the price of liberty is not just eternal vigilance against external enemies, but also vigilance against the abuse of power by our own institutions against our own people. The gas chambers that held 60,000 American soldiers were not in Nazi Germany or Soviet Russia, they were in Maryland. They were operated by the United States Army. And most of the soldiers locked inside them were black men who had volunteered to serve their country and who were exploited because their government believed their lives mattered less than others. That is a truth we cannot change by forgetting it. We can only honor those who suffered by remembering what was done, acknowledging it was wrong, and remaining vigilant to prevent anything similar from ever happening again.